Have you ever stopped to think about what would happen if you died right now, at this very moment, and didn't even realize it? It seems absurd, impossible even, but what I'm about to tell you will turn everything you believe upside down. This is the true story of Marcus Thompson, an ordinary man who woke up in an empty subway thinking he was having a strange day, without imagining that he was living his last hours as a conscious ghost. The truth that nobody wants to accept is this: there is no instruction manual for death, nobody warns you when your last day has arrived, and Marcus entered that subway like you probably left home today, distracted, thinking that life would continue indefinitely. But at 7:15 a.m. on an ordinary Tuesday, he became an invisible man. A true story, a subway accident mystery that would reveal the most terrifying truth. You can cease to exist for the world without realizing it. You can become nothing while still thinking you are someone. What you're about to hear isn't fiction, it's not a horror movie, it's an account that defies all scientific explanation about a man who died in a brutal train derailment but woke up later, trapped between worlds, invisible to everyone he loved, carrying the same regrets that are probably yours, the things left unsaid, the moments postponed, the love not expressed while there was time. If you're watching this now, consider it a warning from the universe to stop living on autopilot, because none of us knows when our last day will come. Marcus found out the hard way, but you still have a chance to learn from his story before it's too late. So subscribe to the channel now, like this video and share it with someone who needs this awakening, because after you understand what really happened to Marcus Thompson on that haunted subway, you'll never leave home the same way again, you'll never postpone that hug, that "I love you," that important conversation, and maybe, just maybe, when your last day comes, you won't have as many regrets as he did. Marcus Thompson slowly opened his eyes, feeling the characteristic swaying of the subway beneath his feet. The first thing he noticed was the silence, a dense, almost palpable silence that enveloped the entire car like a heavy blanket. But wait, it was rush hour, that chaotic time when workers are crammed together like sardines in a can, stuck to each other, complaining about the heat and the lack of space. This invisible man, a true story, began in a way no one would expect, with a deafening silence where there should have been noise. Marcus blinked a few times, trying to push away the strange sensation that was beginning to creep up his spine, that tingling that warns when something is fundamentally wrong with the world around you. He ran his hand over his face, checking if he was still half asleep, if perhaps he had fallen into a deeper sleep than he had imagined. You know those moments when you wake up and for a few seconds you don't know where you are? It was similar, but worse, because Marcus knew exactly where he was, or at least he thought he did. The haunted Brazilian subway had never been part of his daily concerns. He was a practical man who only believed in what he could see and touch. He had worked as a civil engineer for 15 years, dealing with concrete, structures, precise calculations. But at that moment, something in the atmosphere seemed to defy all the logic he knew, as if the laws of physics had been temporarily suspended just for him. The air inside the train car was different too, colder than it should be, with that strange quality you feel in places that have been abandoned for a long time. Marcus looked around searching for some rational explanation. Maybe it was a holiday he had forgotten, or perhaps a surprise strike by the subway workers. But even in those scenarios, there's always someone, always that lonely passenger in the corner, or the security guard making his rounds. The feeling of his last day alive began to settle in his chest, although he still didn't understand why. It was as if his body knew something his mind still refused to accept, that primitive instinct that warns us of danger even before we can rationalize it. Marcus stood up from his orange plastic seat, his legs feeling a little wobbly, and took a few steps toward the window. Outside, the dark tunnels sped by, the occasional lights of the stations flickering like distant stars. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, trying to see any reflection of other passengers, any sign of human life beyond his own. What had begun as a strange morning was rapidly transforming into something far more disturbing, a subway horror story he never imagined he'd be a part of. And worst of all, deep down, a small, insistent voice was beginning to whisper that perhaps the silence wasn't the problem, perhaps the problem was him. Marcus turned slowly, leaving the cold glass behind, and finally allowed his eyes to do what he had avoided until now, a complete scan of the train car. Row by row, seat by seat, His gaze swept over every inch of that space that should have been packed with people. Nothing. Absolutely nothing but empty seats, unattended handrails, and that silence that now seemed to scream in his ears. Marcus's heart began to beat faster, that kind of palpitation you feel when your brain finally registers that something is profoundly wrong. This mysterious subway accident was only beginning to reveal itself, layer by layer, like a macabre onion he hadn't asked to peel. He walked down the central aisle, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the empty space. You know when you're alone in a church or a huge gymnasium and every sound you make seems amplified tenfold? It was exactly like that, but inside a subway car that should never, ever be like that. Marcus touched the handrails, ran his hand over the seats, as if physical touch could somehow conjure the people who should be there. Where was the lady who always carried shopping bags? Where was the group of noisy students who argued about soccer? And that grumpy executive who always complained loudly on his cell phone? All gone, as if they had been erased from existence by a cosmic eraser. The feeling that no one could see him hadn't yet solidified in his mind, but the seeds of this terrible truth were already being planted. Marcus remembered a time, years ago, when he had been trapped in an elevator for 40 minutes during a blackout. The feeling of claustrophobia, of closing in on the walls, of the air thinning. But that had been different. At least he knew what was happening, he knew that eventually someone would come. This was something else entirely, a kind of isolation he had never experienced before. It was as if the universe had decided to conduct a cruel experiment. Let's see how Marcus behaves when all of humanity simply disappears around him. He thought of Sarah, his wife, probably already at work at that moment, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was experiencing something impossible. The irony did not go unnoticed. He who always mocked those true supernatural stories she loved to watch on TV. The train continued its relentless journey through the tunnels, swaying gently on the tracks, completely indifferent to the growing panic of its sole occupant. Marcus gripped a handrail tightly, feeling the cold metal against his palm, and tried to take a deep breath to calm his nerves. Think logically, he said aloud, just to hear some human sound, even if it was his own. You have to have an explanation. You always do. But as those words left his mouth, he could already feel doubt eroding his conviction. Because sometimes, just sometimes, there is no logical explanation. Sometimes reality decides to throw the manual out the window and show you that you never had as much control as you thought. And there, alone in that unfolding, conscious ghost narrative, Marcus began to realize that perhaps he was about to discover truths he would rather never know. Marcus made a decision that seemed obvious. If this carriage was empty, perhaps the others were fine. After all, a carriage might be empty for some technical reason, right? People sometimes avoid entering certain carriages. Maybe the air conditioning was broken, or there was some problem he hadn't noticed. With that spark of hope burning in his chest, he walked to the door connecting the carriages, that narrow, noisy passage that always sways dangerously. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the handle, and he realized he was afraid of what he might find on the other side. Or worse, what he might not find. This Invisible Man true story was becoming more and more distressing with each passing second. The door opened with a familiar metallic creak, and Marcus stepped into the next carriage, his heart in his throat. Empty. Completely, absolutely, devastatingly empty. The same orange seats, the same chrome bars, the same artificial lighting, but not a single human being in sight. He felt his stomach churn, that nauseating sensation that comes when hope is violently ripped from you. No, 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 he murmured, already running to the next door, then the next and another. Car after car, the same scene repeated itself like a nightmare on loop. Empty, empty, empty. It was like being trapped in one of those amusement park halls of mirrors, where you see endless versions of the same thing repeating eternally, only without any fun involved. Marcus stopped in the middle of the empty fourth carriage, breathless, hands on his knees, trying to process what was happening. He had already crossed half the entire train, and each carriage told the same silent story of human absence. Loneliness began to weigh on him like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just being physically alone, but the complete impossibility of explaining what he was experiencing. You know those moments when something bizarre happens to you and you can't wait to tell someone? Now imagine having no one to tell, no one to validate your experience, no one to say, "Wow, that's crazy." Marcus remembered when he was 7 years old and got lost from his parents in a crowded shopping mall. The panic he felt then was child's play compared to what he felt now. That was a dead and turned into a ghost scenario that his mind still refused to fully accept. He continued his solitary walk through the remaining carriages, each one confirming the eerie pattern. The rumble of the tracks beneath his boots echoed ghostly, and Marcus began to notice details he'd never seen before. Small stains on the seats, old stickers stuck to the windows, serial numbers etched into the metal structures. It was as if the world had shrunk to fit only inside that empty train, and he was the sole inhabitant of a parallel reality where everything seemed normal, but nothing was. With each empty carriage, the certainty grew within him. This wasn't about the subway being empty. This was about something far, far more disturbing. And when he finally reached the last carriage and found, once again, only emptiness staring back at him, Marcus felt a fundamental shift occur within him. The painful transition from, "This can't be happening," to, "This is happening, and I need to find out why." What he didn't yet know was that the next stop would bring revelations that would make the emptiness of the carriages seem comforting in comparison. The subway began to slow down with that familiar movement Marcus knew by heart. The gradual reduction in speed, the screech of the brakes, the final sway before the complete stop. For the first time since waking up, he felt a genuine glimmer of relief. Sé Station, one of the busiest in São Paulo, the beating heart of the subway system where thousands of people passed through every minute. Finally, he thought, finally I'll see people, I'll understand what's happening. Marcus positioned himself near the door, his hands already ready to push if there was that typical crowd trying to get in at the same time. This mysterious subway accident was about to gain a new chapter, one that he hoped would bring some answers. The train came to a complete stop, and through the windows Marcus could see what his heart had longed for. People. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, moving across the platform like a living, chaotic organism. There was the street vendor offering sweets, the security guards in orange vests, the hurried passengers checking their cell phones, the families carrying shopping bags. The most normal and banal scene in the world. And for Marcus, at that moment, it was like seeing an oasis in the middle of the desert. He laughed, a somewhat hysterical sound of relief, and waited for the characteristic sound of the doors opening. The signal sounded, ding-dong. The subway doors opened with their usual pneumatic hum. Marcus took a step forward and bumped into an invisible barrier. It was like walking straight into a glass wall you hadn't seen. Marcus staggered back, bringing his hand to his nose, which had bumped against nothing, against the air that had suddenly become solid. He blinked several times, confused, looking at the open door in front of him. It was open, he could see through it, he could see people getting on and off the other carriages, but when he tried to go through again, the same invisible resistance stopped him. It was as if there was a force field, an intangible barrier specifically designed to keep him inside. "This doesn't make sense," he said aloud, frustration tinging his words. Marcus punched the air where there should have been free passage, and his fists met only that strange solidity that shouldn't exist. The feeling that no one could see him began to mix with another, even more terrifying one, that of being trapped. He watched helplessly as passengers boarded other carriages, laughing, chatting, complaining about the heat, completely oblivious to the desperate man just a few meters away, separated from them by a barrier that shouldn't exist. Marcus shouted, yelled for help, waved frantically, but no one looked in his direction. It was like being inside an inverted aquarium, where he was the fish watching the outside world continue its normal routine while he was trapped in an impossible bubble. The beeping sounded again, ding-dong, the warning that the doors were about to close. Marcus made one last desperate attempt to get through, throwing all his weight against the invisible barrier, but it was useless. The doors closed with a final gasp, and the subway began to move again, taking Marcus away from the crowded station, back into the dark tunnels. And as Sé Station disappeared behind him, a new and terrible question began to form in his mind. If the doors wouldn't open for him, what else wasn't working as it should? As the subway pulled away from the station, Marcus remained glued to the window, watching the platform shrink into the distance. It was at that moment, in that fraction of a second before plunging back into the dark tunnels, that something clicked in his mind like a puzzle piece fitting into the wrong place. He mentally replayed the last scenes, all those people on the platform, passing by, pushing, looking at their cell phone screens, checking the schedules on the electronic panel. But none, absolutely none, had looked at him. Even a glance, not even accidentally. And that was strange because he had shouted, he had punched the door, he had done everything to get attention. Any normal person would have at least cast a curious glance, even if only reflexively. This invisible man, a true story, was taking on increasingly frightening dimensions. Marcus mentally returned to specific moments he had observed through the glass. There was a gray-haired woman, carrying a huge green bag, who had walked straight toward him while he was at the window. He had thought, she's going to see me, she's going to realize something's wrong. But the woman didn't look away for a second. Her eyes passed over him as if he were air, as if he were part of the landscape, as if he were nothing. There was also that teenager wearing headphones, who stood right in front of the window where Marcus was, but was looking at his own reflection in the glass, adjusting his hair, completely oblivious to the desperate man on the other side gesturing like a madman. It was as if Marcus had become part of the invisible inventory of the world, like those things that exist but that nobody really sees, lampposts, trash cans, road signs. The realization came slowly, like cold water running down his spine. Marcus stepped away from the window and looked at his own hands, turning them slowly in the artificial light of the train car. They seemed normal, solid, real. He could feel his own weight, he could feel his heart beating in his chest, he could feel the cold sweat on his forehead. He was there, present, occupying space in the universe. And yet people had looked right through him. Not through him. As if their eyes simply didn't register his existence, as if their brains had a blind spot in the exact shape of Marcus Thompson. He remembered a film Sarah had made him watch once, about a man who woke up invisible and had to deal with the consequences. At the time, he had thought it ridiculous, impossible. Now, trapped in that empty train car, it didn't seem so impossible anymore. Marcus began to mentally calculate, trying to find another explanation, any explanation other than the obvious one. Perhaps he was having some kind of nervous breakdown and was hallucinating all of this? Perhaps it was a very vivid dream and he was still at home, in bed, next to Sarah? But the pain in his nose where he had hit the invisible barrier was too real, the metallic smell of the train car was too specific, the noise of the tracks was too constant. This wasn't a dream, it wasn't a hallucination. This was a subway horror story unfolding in real time, and he was the reluctant protagonist. The subway continued its inexorable journey, taking Marcus to the next station, where he would have the opportunity, or would it be a curse, to test his terrible new suspicion once more. And deep down, in a part of his mind he was still trying to ignore, a voice whispered the truth he wasn't ready to accept. Perhaps people couldn't see him because, in some impossible way, he had ceased to be visible to the world of the living. At the next station, Marcus didn't even know which one it was anymore. He'd completely lost track of where he was on the subway map. He made a decision. When the doors opened and the invisible barrier remained there, impenetrable as always, he watched the people getting on the other cars and waited. He waited until a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, wearing a blue nurse's uniform, walked down the platform toward him. She was distracted, fiddling with her cell phone, and would pass very close to the window where Marcus was. He pressed his palm against the glass and thought, when she passes, I'll scream, I'll make the loudest noise I can, and she'll have to hear me. It was a simple, almost childish plan, but it was all he had. This conscious, ghostly account needed some kind of external confirmation, some proof that he still existed. But then something happened that changed everything. As the nurse approached, Marcus realized that his hand, that same hand pressed firmly against the glass, was beginning to pass through it. Not through the glass, but through the very substance of the window, as if the solid glass had turned to jelly, to mist, to nothing. He pulled his hand back quickly, startled, looking at his palm as if it had betrayed him. What the hell was happening? The nurse passed through the window without even looking up, and the subway doors closed again. Marcus stood there, trembling, looking at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. They seemed normal, solid, but he had just seen them pass through solid glass as if it were air. His heart pounding, Marcus approached one of the support bars in the center of the train car. Those chrome bars he had gripped thousands of times during years of daily commuting. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out toward the bar. His fingers touched it, or at least that's what his eyes told him was happening, but there was no resistance. His hand passed straight through the chrome metal as if passing through colored smoke, through a hologram, through a ghost. Except the bar wasn't the ghost. He was. The word echoed in his mind like a scream in a canyon. Ghost, ghost, ghost. Marcus pulled his hand back and observed it, turning it over in the light. How was this possible? How could someone be solid enough to stand, to feel their own weight, but at the same time ethereal enough to pass through solid objects? He performed several tests, each more desperate than the last. He tried to grab the bar. His hand went right through it. He tried to sit on a seat. He sank slightly before stabilizing, as if his body were deciding in real time what his physical state would be. He tried to kick the door. His foot passed through it without making any impact. It was as if he existed in two realities at the same time, solid enough not to fall through the subway floor, but transparent enough not to be able to interact with anything else. Marcus remembered a physics class in school, about states of matter, about how atoms behave. But this went beyond any physics he knew. This was the realm of the impossible, the supernatural, the true supernatural stories he had always ridiculed. And now he was living one. Panic began to give way to a terrifying understanding. If he couldn't touch things, if people looked right through him, if he passed through solid objects like smoke, then what exactly was he? And more importantly, what had he been before waking up in that empty subway car? Marcus raised his hands to face level, positioning them between himself and the fluorescent light on the train car's ceiling. At first, they seemed perfectly normal, the same hands he'd known for 38 years, with that small scar on his left thumb from when he tried to fix a fence at his grandmother's house, the same fingernails Sarah always complained he bit when he was nervous. But then, as he observed them more closely, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. He could see the light through them. It wasn't obvious, it wasn't like looking through clear glass, but it was as if his hands were made of semi-transparent wax, or that frosted glass they use in bathrooms for privacy. Through the palm of his right hand, he could very faintly make out the outline of the fluorescent light on the ceiling. This invisible man, a true story, was becoming literal in a way he never imagined possible. He brought his hands even closer to his eyes, studying every detail with the intensity of a scientist examining a new species. The lines of his palms were still there, the fingerprints were still visible, but everything had an ethereal quality, as if he were looking at his own hands through a thin layer of tracing paper. Marcus turned his hands slowly, observing how the light interacted with them, or rather, how it passed through them. It was subtle, very subtle, and he understood why he hadn't noticed it before. You don't normally examine your own hands, do you? You simply assume they're there, solid and reliable as they always have been. But now, with this strange translucency, it was as if he were slowly dissolving, as if he were transitioning from solid to liquid, from liquid to gas, from gas to what? To nothing? The discovery triggered a wave of frantic experimentation. Marcus pulled up the sleeve of his dress shirt, the light blue shirt Sarah had ironed the night before, leaving it neatly folded on the chair in the room. He lifted the sleeve to his elbow and examined his arm. The same eerie translucency was there, running the length of his skin, hair, and the veins he had previously been able to see pulsing beneath the surface. Now they were just bluish shadows traversing a substance that was no longer quite flesh. He looked at his legs, lifted the hem of his trousers, same effect. He ran his hand over his face, feeling the familiar contours of his nose, cheekbones, and jaw, but when he looked at his reflection in the dark window of the train car, he saw a blurry, faded image, like an overexposed photograph or a hologram with a weak battery. What Marcus saw reflected was no longer exactly a man. It was the suggestion of a man, the memory of a man, the visual echo of someone who was no longer fully present. Marcus let himself fall into one of the seats, or rather, he sort of floated until he was in a seated position, since there was no longer the solid impact that there should be when an 80-kilogram body throws itself into a plastic chair. He held his head between his translucent hands, trying to process what all this meant. It was as if he were in an inexorable progression towards complete disappearance, like a candle slowly melting or an old recording being erased little by little. How much time did he have? Hours? Days? And where was he going? If he was going anywhere at all. The idea of the last day of his life took on a whole new meaning. Perhaps it wasn't technically his last day of life, but perhaps it was his last day of visible existence, of physical presence, of connection with the material world. And as the subway continued its journey through the dark tunnels of Sao Paulo, Marcus Thompson, civil engineer, husband of Sarah, son of Dona Celia, looked at his own hands becoming more and more like frosted glass and wondered how much of himself would remain when he finally reached the next station. At some point, Marcus couldn't say exactly when because time had begun to behave strangely, stretching and compressing like an elastic band. He realized the subway had stopped definitively. Not at a specific station, but simply stopped. As if his journey in that empty car had come to a natural end. And in the same mysterious way that the invisible barrier had prevented him from leaving before, now there was nothing holding him back. Marcus stepped through the door of the car, literally through it, feeling the bizarre sensation of metal and circuits passing through his translucent body, and found himself in a station he vaguely recognized. But the recognition mattered less than the astonishing fact that he was finally free from that prison car. Free, but for what exactly? This, no one can see me, nightmare was about to expand from the subway to the entire world. Marcus climbed the station's escalators, or rather, walked alongside them, since his feet couldn't make firm enough contact with the metal steps. Around him, people went up and down, hurrying as always, trapped in their individual bubbles of worries and tasks. A man in a suit passed right by his shoulder, and Marcus felt that sensation that was now becoming familiar, the strange vibration of another matter passing through his semi-existence. The man didn't notice anything, didn't stumble, didn't look back. He simply kept walking as if he had passed through an air current. Marcus emerged onto the street and the daylight, he didn't know what time it was, but the sun was high, fell on him weightlessly, without warmth, as if it were just a suggestion of light instead of the real thing. The city was alive around him, pulsating with that chaotic energy that only Sao Paulo possesses. Buses honked, street vendors shouted their wares, a street musician played guitar on a corner, groups of students laughed loudly while eating street fair pastries. Marcus walked along the sidewalk, or rather, glided along it, because walking wasn't quite the right word to describe his movement anymore. It was more like intentionally floating, as if his body had forgotten it should have weight but still vaguely remembered the idea of walking. He passed a bakery where he always had breakfast before taking the subway, and the smell of fresh bread didn't reach him. He passed a newsstand where he'd known the owner for years, and Mr. Antonio didn't even look up from his cell phone. It was like being in a ghost town, except the city was perfectly alive. He was the ghost. Marcus tried everything to get people's attention. He stood in the middle of the sidewalk, and people simply walked around him without noticing, like water flowing around a stone. He shouted the names of acquaintances he saw passing by, Joanna from accounting, Miguel who worked in the same building as him, but their voices heard nothing, they didn't even turn their heads. He tried to grab a newspaper from a newsstand, and his hand passed through the paper as if it were mist passing through mist. He tried to touch a child who ran past, and the child passed through his outstretched arm without even slowing down, without feeling anything. It was like being an invisible film director, watching a real-life movie where he no longer had any role, where his presence or absence made no difference whatsoever. This subway horror story had expanded into an urban horror story, and Marcus was at the center of it, completely alone in a crowd of millions. And as he walked, or floated, or glided, or whatever it was he was doing, through the familiar streets that suddenly seemed strange and hostile, a single question hammered in his mind. If no one could see him, if he couldn't touch anything, if the world kept turning without registering his existence, where should he go now? There was only one place Marcus wanted to be, home. It was a primal instinct, that need to return to the nest when everything around him is crumbling. He didn't even need to think much about it. His translucent feet simply carried him in the familiar direction, crossing blocks he knew by heart, turning corners he'd turned 1,000 times before. His and Sarah's apartment was in a modest building in the Liberdade neighborhood, a 7-story building built in the 70s, with those small windows and railings on the balconies. Marcus had complained 1,000 times about the lack of an elevator, about having to climb 4 flights of stairs every day. Now, he would give anything to feel the real exhaustion of climbing those steps, to feel his leg muscles burning, his heart racing. But ghosts don't get tired, he was discovering. Ghosts just exist. When he arrived at the building, Marcus stopped in front of the glass and metal gate of the main entrance. It was a door he had opened thousands of times with his key, a temperamental lock that you had to turn in a specific way or it would jam. He instinctively reached into his pocket, searching for his keys, and found nothing. His pockets were empty, or rather, the feeling of pockets was there but nothing inside. Where were his things? His wallet, his cell phone, his keys? Marcus couldn't remember losing anything, but he also couldn't remember having them. It was as if personal objects were no longer part of his translucent existence. He looked at the locked door, then at his half-transparent hands, and an absurd but logical possibility arose in his mind. This invisible waking nightmare had at least one advantage. Locked doors were no longer a problem. Marcus took a deep breath, or the ghostly equivalent of a deep breath, and walked toward the door. Part of him expected to slam against the solid surface as he had with the barrier in the subway, but this time it was different. The door didn't stop him. The glass and the metal passed through him, or he passed through them. It was difficult to tell which was the subject and which was the object in this impossible interaction. It was a strange sensation, like plunging into cold jelly, like passing through a curtain of frozen rain. For a brief moment, Marcus was inside the molecular structure of the door, feeling the glass and the metal coexist in the same space he occupied, and then, in the blink of an eye, he was on the other side, inside the building's lobby. He had done it. He had passed through solid matter intentionally, with control. It was terrifying and, in a small, secret part of his mind that he barely admitted, somewhat impressive. The lobby was empty, or at least it seemed so, but Marcus no longer trusted his perceptions of empty spaces. He passed the familiar hall, with those beige tiles that Mrs. Marissa, the building manager, always said needed replacing, past the mailbox where his name was still written in faded cursive, Marcus Thompson, Apartment 42. Seeing his name there, solid and real, engraved in plastic and metal, was strangely comforting. At least I had physical proof that he had existed, that he had been real enough to receive mail, to have an address, to be part of the tangible world. Marcus began to climb the stairs, and discovered he could choose. He could feel the steps beneath his feet if he concentrated, or he could simply float to the next floor if he let go. He chose to feel the steps, because he needed the illusion of normalcy, he needed to pretend for a few minutes that he was still human. And as he climbed toward the 4th floor, toward Apartment 42, toward Sarah, Marcus wondered what he would find on the other side of that door. Would she be home? And if she was, would she be able to see him, to feel his presence, when the rest of the world clearly couldn't? Or was he about to discover that this dead and ghost scenario applied even to the people he loved most? Marcus walked through the door of Apartment 42 the same way he had walked through the door of the building, but this time the feeling was different, more painful, more emotionally charged. It was like raping his own home, entering without permission the space he and Sarah had built together over 12 years of marriage. The apartment was exactly as he remembered it, the small but cozy living room, the beige sofa Sarah had insisted on buying even though it was more expensive than the gray one, the framed photos on the wall showing happy moments, their wedding, that trip to Gramadoo, her mother's birthday. Everything normal, everything familiar. Except for the sound coming from the bedroom. A sound that broke Marcus's ghostly heart. Sarah was crying. He found her sitting on the edge of their bed, her cell phone pressed against her ear so hard that her knuckles were white. She was wearing that blue robe Marcus always said made her look beautiful, but now it was crumpled and crooked, as if she'd put it on in a hurry or slept in it. Sarah's eyes were red and swollen, not the kind of redness from crying once, but the kind that comes from hours, maybe a whole day of tears. She dialed a number repeatedly, waited, and Marcus heard his own voice coming from the voicemail. "Hi, this is Marcus, I can't answer right now, but leave a message." The recorded voice sounded strangely cheerful, carefree, as if it belonged to someone else. Another time, another universe where people had normal problems like forgetting to answer the phone. "Marcus, please, please answer," Sarah whispered into the phone, her voice broken and hoarse. "I know you're angry with me because of yesterday's argument, I know, but please come home." "The police, they called, love. They said there was an accident on the subway. They're asking me to go to the place where—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She simply collapsed, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from a place so deep that Marcus felt them physically, even though he was half transparent. He knelt in front of her, or tried to kneel, his knees slightly breaking through the plush carpet before encountering some resistance, and reached out to touch her face, to wipe away the tears that wouldn't stop falling. His translucent hands brushed against her cheeks like air passing through air, leaving no trace, no warmth, no comfort. "Sarah, I'm here," Marcus said, knowing it was useless, but unable to remain silent. "I'm right here. Look at me, please, just look at me." But Sarah kept looking at the phone, dialing again, hearing again the same cheerful voicemail message that now sounded like a cruel mockery of fate. Marcus tried to embrace her, wrapped his arms around her body, but it was like trying to hug smoke or hold water between his fingers. He couldn't offer comfort, couldn't dry her tears, couldn't say everything was all right because clearly it wasn't. All he could do was watch helplessly as the woman he loved suffered alone 3 feet away from him. And in that moment, Marcus understood that this conscious ghostly account wasn't just about him discovering he was dead, it was about discovering that death wasn't the end of suffering, it was only the beginning of a new kind of pain, one where you have to watch the people you love suffer for you without being able to do absolutely anything to help. Sarah collapsed onto her side in bed, still holding the phone, murmuring his name between sobs, and Marcus remained there, kneeling on the rug, his translucent hands outstretched toward her, connected only by the memory of what had been, separated by the terrible reality of what was now. Sarah finally rose from the bed with slow, heavy movements, as if each gesture cost an enormous amount of energy she no longer possessed. She walked to the living room, wiping her face with the back of her hand in a gesture Marcus knew so well. It was what she always did when trying to pull herself together, when trying to be strong even when shattered inside. Marcus followed her, floating a few inches behind her, close enough to sense what remained of her presence but far enough away not to accidentally pass through her. Sarah picked up the remote control with trembling hands and turned on the television, frantically changing channels until she found a news program. And that's when Marcus saw it. That's when the last piece of the impossible puzzle finally fell into place. The screen showed aerial images of a subway station. His subway station, the one where he had taken the train every morning for 7 years. But it was completely transformed, ambulances with flashing lights, firefighters running back and forth, a crowd of onlookers being contained by yellow barrier tape. The caption at the bottom of the screen read in large red letters, "Subway derailment leaves 23 dead and dozens injured." The reporter, a woman in a navy blue blazer with a serious expression, spoke in that controlled tone that journalists use to report tragedies. Rescue teams continue working at the site of the accident that occurred around 7:15 this morning. According to witnesses, there was a fault in the tracks that caused the derailment of 3 cars in the area of the curve near the station. Marcus couldn't process the rest. His brain had frozen on the words, 7:15. Exactly the time he took the subway. Every single day. Without fail. The camera cut to earlier footage showing the wreckage, twisted metal, shattered glass. A train car completely overturned on its side like a broken toy discarded by a giant child. Marcus recognized the orange seats, the chrome bars now contorted at impossible angles. It was the same car where he had woken up. Or thought he had woken up. The screen changed again, this time showing photos of the victims, smiling faces of people who had left home that morning thinking it was just another ordinary day. And then, among those faces, his appeared. Marcus Thompson, 38 years old, civil engineer, read the caption under the photo Sarah had taken of him last Christmas, where he was smiling, holding a glass of champagne, without the slightest idea that he only had a few months to live. Sarah let out a sharp, almost animalistic groan and dropped the remote control on the floor. "No, no, no," she repeated like a mantra, shaking her head violently. as if she could deny reality by the sheer force of refusal. Marcus was frozen in place, staring at his own picture on the television, listening to the reporter talk about him in the past tense. Marcus Thompson was a respected engineer, married, childless, known to his neighbors as a kind and helpful person. Not is. Past tense. Perfect tense. The grammar of death. Everything made sense now. The empty carriage, the people looking through him, the translucency of his hands, the inability to touch anything. He wasn't trapped in a nightmare or a parallel dimension. He was dead. Completely, definitively, irreversibly dead. This mystery subway accident had an answer, and the answer was that there was no mystery at all, just the brutal and simple tragedy of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marcus had died that morning, probably instantly when the train derailed, and whatever he was now, this translucent consciousness, this reluctant ghost, was all that remained, the ethereal remnant of a life that had been abruptly cut short. And while Sarah collapsed onto the sofa, her body shaking with a nameless pain, Marcus remained there, an invisible man, a real story finally understanding the terrible truth. He was no longer a man, just a story, a memory, an echo that would soon, very soon, disappear completely. The acceptance of the truth didn't come like a bolt of lightning or a dramatic revelation. It came slowly, like water filling a leaky boat, inevitable and heavy. Marcus let himself fall onto the sofa next to Sarah, or rather, he kind of sank into it, his translucent body deciding for itself how much resistance the upholstery should offer. He was dead. Those 3 words echoed in his mind like funeral bells, each repetition making them more real, more concrete, more impossible to deny. Marcus Thompson had died at 7:15 in the morning, in a subway car that derailed, along with 22 other people who had also simply left home thinking they were going to work, shopping, visiting someone. People with plans, with dreams, with bills to pay and coffees to drink. And now they were all just statistics in a story, photos on a screen, names on a list. He looked at his translucent hands again, but this time with a different understanding. They weren't malfunctioning hands or hands experiencing some temporary anomaly. They were ghost hands, literally. He was a conscious, walking ghost, a dead man who had woken up without realizing he had died, who had spent hours confused in an empty train car without understanding that the car wasn't empty. He was the one who wasn't really there anymore. Marcus remembered all those stories Sarah liked to read, about people who died but wouldn't accept it, who remained trapped between worlds, observing the living without being able to interact. He had always thought it was nonsense, superstition, stories to scare children. Now he was the protagonist of one of those stories, and there was nothing comforting about discovering that some legends were true. Marcus's mind began to replay fragments of the morning, or what he thought the morning had been like. He remembered getting on the subway, holding onto the handrail, looking at his phone checking emails. And then, nothing. A black hole in his memory, a complete void, and then waking up in that unnatural silence. He didn't remember the accident itself, the impact, the pain, the exact moment his life had ended. It was as if his brain, or what remained of it, had gently edited that part, sparing him the trauma of his own end. Perhaps it was mercy, or perhaps that was just how death worked. You simply faded away, like a candle being blown out, and if you were lucky, or unlucky depending on your point of view, you woke up on the other side without quite understanding what had happened. Marcus thought about all the things he would never do again. He would never again have breakfast with Sarah on Sundays, their ritual of making pancakes while listening to music. He would never again drive to his mother's house in Santos for family lunches. He would never again taste cold beer on a hot day, or smell the approaching rain, or feel Sarah's skin against his. All those small, banal sensations that you take for granted, that you assume will always be available, all cut off at once, permanently. He was 38 years old. He should have at least 40 more years ahead of him, maybe 50 if he was lucky. But the universe had other plans, and the universe doesn't ask permission, doesn't negotiate, doesn't give second chances. This last day of life that he had lived without knowing it was his last, what had he done? He had argued with Sarah over some nonsense that he now didn't even remember properly. He had left home in a hurry. He had forgotten to say, "I love you." How many people do that? They leave through the door without imagining it's the last time, leaving unspoken words and ungiven hugs, assuming there will always be a tomorrow to fix things, to talk, to live. And now Marcus was living proof, or was it dead proof, that tomorrow is not guaranteed for anyone, and that you can become a dead ghost in history before you even realize your story is over. The hours passed with that strange quality that time has when you're in deep suffering, at once dragging like cold honey and quick as a blink. Marcus no longer knew if ghosts felt time the same way the living did, but he stayed there, beside Sarah, as the sun streamed through the living room window and began its slow descent toward the horizon. She cried until she had no more tears, until her throat was hoarse, until her body simply gave up and lay there, on the sofa, staring at the ceiling with that empty look of someone whose soul had been ripped away. People came and went, Sarah's sister, some neighbors bringing food that no one would eat, a priest she barely knew but whom someone had thought appropriate to call. Marcus observed everything like an invisible spectator at the funeral of his own life. Night fell over São Paulo with its characteristic darkness, that kind of urban night that's never completely dark because of the city lights. Sarah finally dragged herself to the bedroom, leaving the living room lights on, leaving the TV on at a low volume because the silence was unbearable. Marcus followed her, that invisible man from a true story condemned to observe but never participate. She lay down on their bed, now only hers, and hugged his pillow, the one that still smelled of him, and began to cry again, but this time they were silent tears, the kind of crying that comes from the deepest part of the soul where words cannot reach. Marcus lay down beside her, or at least assumed the position of lying down, his translucent body floating slightly above the mattress. He tried everything. He ran his translucent hand through her hair, hoping that perhaps, just perhaps, some part of her could feel it. He whispered, "I'm here," 1,000 times, each time with more despair, each time with less hope. He tried to embrace her, to envelop her body with what remained of his, to create some kind of comfort, even if only thermal, only energetic. But it was useless. Completely, absolutely useless. Sarah was alone in her suffering, and Marcus was alone in his powerlessness. They shared the same physical space but existed in completely different dimensions, separated by a barrier as thin as the veil between life and death, but as insurmountable as the universe itself. It was a torture of a kind Marcus hadn't imagined existed, to be present but absent, to see but not be seen, to want to help but be completely irrelevant. Sometime in the early morning, Sarah finally fell asleep, exhausted from crying and pain. Marcus watched her sleeping face, that face he knew so well, every little wrinkle around her eyes when she smiled, the dimple in her chin that she always said she hated but that he found beautiful. She looked older like that, worn out, as if she had aged 10 years in a single day. And Marcus had a terrible realization. He wasn't there just to say goodbye. He was there to witness what her death had done, to bear the weight of knowing exactly how much pain her absence would cause. It wasn't just about him dying. It was about all the people left behind, carrying the hole his existence had left. This conscious ghostly account was as much about the living as it was about the dead, about the invisible connection that binds people and that, apparently, not even death can completely sever. Marcus stayed there all night, an invisible guardian of Sarah's restless sleep, unable to ward off her nightmares, unable to dry the tears that still streamed down her face even as she slept, but also unable to leave, to abandon her, to do the only thing he probably should, leave for wherever ghosts go when they finally accept their fate. While Sarah slept her restless sleep, Marcus found himself doing what every dead person probably does when confronted with absolute finitude, reviewing his life as if it were a film edited by a cruel director who chooses only the moments of regret. He thought about yesterday's silly argument. It already seemed like an eternity ago, but it had literally been the eve of his death. Sarah wanted him to spend less time at work, for them to take a vacation, to enjoy life more together. And he had responded with that typical curtness of someone who is tired and stressed. "Sarah, we can't just drop everything and travel. I have responsibilities." Responsibilities. What a ridiculous word now. What an absolutely irrelevant concept in the face of death. No one on their deathbed thinks, "Wow, how good that I worked that extra Saturday." But everyone thinks about the vacations they didn't take, the I love yous they didn't say, the hugs they postponed. Marcus remembered when his father had died 3 years ago. Lung cancer, rapid and brutal progression. In his last days, the old man had tried to have the talk with him, that conversation parents try to have with their children when they know their time is running out. But Marcus had dodged him, changed the subject, said, "Don't talk like that, Dad, you'll get better." Comfortable lies that only serve to spare the discomfort of those who are still alive. And now he understood perfectly what his father had wanted to say but couldn't, that life is absurdly short, that the things that seem important aren't, that love is the only thing left when everything else is ripped away from you. Marcus had never told his father how much he admired him, how much that simple, working-class man, without formal education, had been his hero. He had never thanked him for the sacrifices, for the extra nights of work to pay for his college, for the silent but constant love. And now he was on the other side, a ghost unable to speak to the living person he loved most. He thought about all the later days he had left behind. Later I'll learn to play the guitar. Later I'll travel to that place. Later I'll make peace with that friend I fought with over something silly. Later, later, later. As if there were an infinite supply of later days available in life stock, as if you could simply withdraw one when you needed it. But that's not how it works. Life isn't a bank account where you deposit time to use later. Life is a river that flows in only one direction, and you're in it whether you like it or not, and one day, without warning, the current carries you away and it's over. Marcus had wasted so much time on insignificant worries, what people would think of him, whether he was earning enough money, whether he was in the right career. He had spent entire Sundays on the couch scrolling through the endless feed of social media instead of really talking to Sarah, instead of calling his mother, instead of actually living. But the most painful regret, the one that truly stung in a translucent heart that theoretically shouldn't feel pain, was about the children they never had. Sarah wanted them, had wanted them for years. But Marcus always had an excuse. It wasn't the right time financially, he wanted to wait for a promotion, they were too young, then they became too old in his mind. The truth, which he never admitted even to himself, was that he was afraid. Afraid of the responsibility, afraid of not being a good father, afraid of changing the comfortable life they had. And now Sarah was there, alone, without even a piece of him alive in the form of a child, without anyone to carry his eyes or his smile into the future. Marcus had stolen that from her with his postponements, with his silly fears, with his illusion that there would always be time later. And this supernatural true story he was living had a brutal lesson embedded within it. There is no guarantee of tomorrow, no promise of second chances, no way to go back and choose differently. You live once, you make one mistake, and when you realize you made a mistake, it's too late to fix it. Marcus floated there in the dark room, beside the woman he loved but could not touch, carrying the weight of all the should-have-done moments that were now just ghosts of dead possibilities, as translucent and powerless as he himself. The first light of day began to filter through the bedroom curtains, that soft, gray luminosity that precedes the actual sunrise. Marcus felt something shift within him, or around him. It was difficult to distinguish where he ended and the world began now. It was as if his translucent body was responding to the light in a way that had nothing to do with physics, but with something deeper, more fundamental. He looked at his own hands and realized they were even more transparent than the night before. It was no longer frosted glass. It was almost fresh air, almost invisible even to himself. His time was running out. He knew it with a visceral certainty that needed no explanation. Ghosts don't stay forever, apparently. They have an expiration date, a specific window between death and whatever comes after. Marcus looked at Sarah sleeping beside him, her face finally at peace after hours of torment. He wanted to etch that image into his memory. If ghosts even have memories, if there is any form of consciousness in what was to come. He wanted to memorize every detail, the way her hair fell onto the pillow, the small wrinkle between her eyebrows that appeared even in her sleep, the gentle movement of her chest rising and falling. "I'm sorry," he whispered, knowing she wouldn't hear but needing to say it nonetheless. "I'm sorry for all the times I put work before you, for all the later times that never came, For not being the husband you deserved while I still could be. I'm sorry for leaving you alone. The words streamed down now, a lifetime of regrets condensed into a few final seconds of translucent existence. He leaned in, or the ghostly equivalent of leaning in, and tried to kiss Sarah's forehead one last time. His non-existent lips didn't touch her skin, but for a brief instant, the briefest of instants, Marcus swore he felt something. A connection, a flash, as if for a microscopic fraction of a second he had managed to cross the barrier between worlds and truly touch the woman he loved. Perhaps it was real, perhaps it was just a last gift of imagination before the absolute end. It didn't matter. He would accept any crumb of connection the universe wanted to offer. Sarah stirred slightly in her sleep, and for a terrible and wonderful moment, Marcus thought she would wake up, that she would look directly at him and finally see him. But she only murmured something unintelligible, hugged the pillow tighter, and went back to sleep. The light was getting brighter now, and with it, Marcus felt his body, or what was left of it, beginning to truly dissolve. It wasn't painful, it wasn't frightening. It was almost comforting. Like finally being able to rest after an exhausting day, like letting go of a weight you'd been carrying for too long. He got out of bed one last time and walked to the window, watching Sao Paulo waking up below, cars starting to circulate, bakeries opening, people leaving for work, for school, to live their normal lives without the slightest idea that there, in that fourth-floor apartment, a ghost was saying goodbye to the world. Marcus thought of all the other people who had died in the accident with him, wondered if they too had had this extra time, if they too had wandered invisibly for a few hours trying to make sense of the impossible. He hoped so. He hoped they all had had the chance to say goodbye, even if the farewell was invisible and unanswered. "Goodbye, Sarah," he said one last time, turning to look at her sleeping peacefully. "Live well. Live for both of us. Don't let the later take over your life like I did. Enjoy every moment, every person, every opportunity to be happy. And when your time comes, many, many years from now, I'll be waiting. Wherever we go after all this, I'll be there." The sunlight finally broke through the horizon completely, filling the room with that golden dawn light, and Marcus felt his body truly begin to dissolve, like mist dissipating in the heat of the day. He didn't fight it. He had no reason to fight anymore. His story was over, and now it was time to turn the page, to move on to the next chapter, whatever it might be. And as he disappeared, translucent particle by translucent particle, Marcus Thompson had one last thought, one last understanding before the complete end. Death is not the opposite of life, it is only a part of it. And love, that love he felt for Sarah until the last atom of his ghostly existence, that was eternal, that transcended barriers, that would continue somehow, somewhere, because some things are too great to die completely. And then, like me. So, after hearing this whole story, do you still think you have plenty of time? That you can postpone that important conversation? That hug you owe? That "I love you" that gets stuck in your throat? Marcus Thompson was exactly like you. He woke up every day thinking that life would go on, that there would always be a later, that regrets could be fixed later. But there was no later for him. There was only a subway car, an accident, and the brutal realization that everything he had postponed was now impossible to achieve. So I ask you, how many laters are you accumulating in your life? How many people do you love but don't tell? How many dreams are you saving for a moment that may never come? Marcus's story isn't just his, it's a mirror of how we all live, postponing the essential, prioritizing the urgent over the important, pretending we are immortal. Now it's your turn to act. Pick up your phone right now and text someone you love but haven't spoken to in ages. Call that person you had a silly fight with. Tell your dad, your mom, your partner how much they mean to you. Don't wait for the perfect moment, because it doesn't exist. The perfect moment is now, while you still can, while you're still alive and visible, while your words can still be heard and your hugs can still be felt. Take that trip off the drawing board, start that project you've been putting off for years, truly live instead of just existing on autopilot. Because the difference between Marcus and you is just a matter of time, and nobody knows how much time they have. Do you want to be just another invisible ghost carrying regrets? Or do you want to be someone who lived each moment intensely? So answer me in the comments. What is the later that you will transform into now, today? What conversation will you have? What person will you seek out? What change will you make in your life before it's too late? And if this story impacted you in any way, if it made you rethink your choices, subscribe to the channel now and activate the notification bell, because every week I bring real stories that will make you question everything you believe about life, death, and what exists in between. Share this video with someone who needs this awakening, because maybe you are the angel who will save that person from a lifetime of regrets. Marcus didn't have a second chance, but you do. The question is, what will you do with it?